more calls. I'm going to read this whole thing to you because it's funny. I mean, it's just absolutely hilarious, and I don't see it. People are buying that too. They think, oh, Gary Hunt is a patriot leader, a militia leader. He's not. He doesn't have a militia. He's not in a militia. He's not a patriot leader. He's a bullshit artist, is what he is, folks, and a provocateur. He has just spent most of the last few years trying to get patriots to do stupid things so that they can be discredited and laughed at and locked up and thrown in jail so that these socialists can have their new world order. Pretty soon there's not going to be anybody left to oppose it if you all keep going off the deep end and buying into all this crap. Oh, boy. Let me read you something here somebody posted to me on the internet. It says, in the past few weeks, Art Bell has been saying that a large object is following behind the Hale-Bopp comet and that it is larger than the Earth. Some of this info can be found on his homepage at www.artbell.com. He has also said that the object has been sending a warning radio message. It's warning us. It's coming to attack us, but it's warning us so we can get ready and kill it before it gets here. Yeah, that's something enemy armies always do. They always warn the other side, you know. He says, this all sounds very suspicious, and it may be in line with scenario number 5 from Behold a Pale Horse. That's my book, folks, and that's exactly what it's in line with. This seems to be a plan to bring the masses to believe that an alien threat is upon us. Also, Mr. Bell has refused to discuss Freemasons on his talk show and is promoting global positioning systems to the public. His radio audience is said to be about 10 million through over 60 affiliates, and the broadcast is in the very early morning hours, and people just rave over this stuff. They think it's the cat's meow. 520-333-4578 is the number. I think I'm going to read this from Gary Hunt so that you'll all be able to know what it is that I'm talking about here. This is from Gary Hunt, the Outpost of Freedom. Actually, it's the Outpost of Entrapment, ladies and gentlemen. It's called Terrorism or an Act of War. Listen very carefully to the bullshit that Gary Hunt is spreading around now to everybody, and they're reading it and calling it a stroke of genius. Dresden, Germany, February 1945, a series of Allied bombing raids resulted in virtual firestorms, nearly destroying this city, which dated from the early 13th century, along with many of its centuries-old architectural landmarks. 135,000 people, the vast majority being women and children, died during these raids. August 1945, Hiroshima, Japan, 3/5 of the city destroyed, along with 75,000 people, mostly women and children. Just a few days later, another atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, destroying half the city and killing another 75,000 people, again mostly women and children. These 3 events killed 285,000 people, yet they were acts of war and were intended to end World War II. During the Vietnam War, Haiphong, the major North Vietnamese city, was bombed over and over, and in 1972 the harbor was mined. Much of the city was destroyed and tens of thousands lost their lives. There was, however, no declaration of war to justify these acts, yet we perceive them to be acts of war. April 15, 1986, in a strategic operation, naval air forces attacked military targets in Tripoli, Libya. One of those targets was the home of Muammar Gaddafi. Hundreds were killed, yet no declaration of war had existed between the United States and Libya. December 20, 1989, United States forces under the operational name Just Cause invaded Panama with the purported purpose of arresting Manuel Noriega on drug trafficking and money laundering charges. Hundreds died and significant damage to the capital of Panama resulted. After trial in December 1992, the federal judge from Miami ruled that Noriega was a prisoner of war. On January 15, 1991, unified forces from 31 nations began a new form of warfare without declaration against Iraq. For 5 weeks, smart missiles and smart bombs were directed against the capital, Tehran. Smart bombs were able to enter ventilation stacks of bomb shelters, killing women and children without destroying the shelter. Cruise missiles traveled hundreds of miles to explode close to their targets, killing tens of thousands of civilians in this new game of attrition. Never, however, a treaty of peace, for there was never a declaration of war. These acts are not considered to be acts of terrorism, for they occurred during the course of a war. It is quite clear that during a war, acts which might otherwise be considered below the dignity of man can occur and be accepted as a consequence of war. If there is a war and thousands die, those deaths are written off as a consequence of war. Even without the accepted norm of a declaration, war can be waged against innocent civilians with no effort made for discrimination of targets. Now remember, folks, this is not me saying this. This is Gary Hunt. I'm reading from a letter that he posted on the Internet. Since the declaration of war has become an unnecessary act, perhaps we can find a way of determining when a war exists by other means. In the academic American Encyclopedia, under court, we find that courts fulfill three important functions. One, they resolve disputes that, while often routine, are crucial to those involved. Two, they provide protection from illegal actions by government and individuals. And three, occasionally they resolve disputes of great political and social significance. Clearly, then, under a normal circumstance, protection from illegal acts by government should leave the government open to be punished by the court. It might then be said that if government can commit illegal acts with impunity, that a state of war exists. No judicial process will hold the victors to task. Justice must be set aside during time of war, which is clearly affirmed in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 2, dealing with habeas corpus, and Article 5, Bill of Rights, dealing with exemption from grand jury process. So perhaps war, since declarations have become a thing of the past, can best be determined by the fact that no trials are held to determine justice or injustice for the deaths that are a consequence of hostile action. How else in this modern age can the determination be made that a war even existed? This being the case, perhaps we should look around and see if there are other wars going on, perhaps at this very moment. Maybe we should start back in August 1992. Hostilities broke out, and in the first incident, 2 men were killed. Hostilities ceased for a few days, but then another act of senseless murder occurred when Vicki Weaver stood in her doorway and was killed by a single sniper's bullet. Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. I had to take a drink of water there. Well, this was clearly not a war, since a trial was held. Unfortunately, even though 3 people were killed, none were found guilty. This, then, must be a war, because war crimes trials were held, but the heinous offender could not be identified. You see this convoluted logic, folks? Just a few months later, another war began. This war lasted 51 days, and the subsequent war crimes trials were held almost a year later. We know that this was a war because 9 people were found guilty of killing or other related acts of complicity, 4 men who were dressed and equipped as soldiers. Now, the enemy soldiers killed in these 2 incidents had some common ideologies, and they had other ideologies that were at opposite ends of the spectrum. That, however, was true from World War II to Operation Desert Storm. It is the side that you take that determines which side you are on during a war. Whoop-de-doo. He had to write this whole letter to determine that. We can determine which side each side was on in these last 2 incidents by looking at a couple of factors. I don't have to look at anything. I know the Branch Davidians were the Branch Davidians and the other ones were the Nazi jackbooted thugs. By looking at a couple of factors. First was the uniform. One side chose black military uniforms, complete with web gear, automatic rifles, tanks, helicopters, grenades, and other modern implements of the game of war. The other side wore normal clothes, jeans, dresses, sneakers, etc., and used simple legal weapons. They also sought refuge in their home and place of worship. The final indicator is that they fired only in self-defense. Surely these were of the same side in this most recent war, and it must be war, since even the commanding general at the Justice Department in Washington, D.C. never described the acts of the enemy as terrorism. On April 22, 1993, I left Waco after 47 days to return to Florida. He also left with a copy of our press credentials that he stole from us. I remember that I was somewhat dumbfounded by the events of April 19th, and until I returned to Waco in mid-May, had not been able to sort out certain thoughts. When I returned to Waco and finally stood on the concrete that was once the floor of the Mount Carmel Church, I looked around and saw partially burned remnants of utensils, clothes, books, letters, and toys, indicative of the lives once lived and since lost here. I recalled similar situations in Vietnam and realized finally that there was a state of war here in the United States of America. I realized that I was at war with the United States government, but that the war that I was in was still a Cold War. Not so for those who died in those ashes, but for many, a state of war had begun. Excuse me. Excuse me. Then comes another group of soldiers, jeans, slacks, driving cars and trucks, not tanks, and counter these previous self-defensive acts of war with an act that is a bit more offensive, but no more so than the initial acts the